Hello and welcome to Moderate Fantasy Violence, a podcast about pop culture and the world around it. I'm Alastair.
And I'm Nick.
And this week we will be discussing Martin Scorsese's historical epic Silence, the film adaptation of Patrick Ness's YA novel A Monster Calls, and checking back in with Series 4 of Sherlock. We will also be finding out what Nick thought of the Levellers' seminal 1990s folk punk album Leveling the Land. But before all of that, Nick, what have you been up to since we last spoke?
Well, since we last podcasted, I've had time to actually enact one of my New Year's resolutions, and that resolution was to actually start reading more books again, because to be honest, I'd kind of fallen a bit behind on that. The Ben Aranovich book I read for this podcast was one of about 5 books I read last year. It wasn't great reading-wise, it really wasn't. Yeah, I've got a shorter commute now than I used to, so I don't seem to fit quite as much reading in. Anyway, we don't listen to this podcast for the riveting details of my personal life. Yeah, so the first book I've read, perhaps unsensibly, I don't know, I started with a massive literary novel, was The Bone Clocks, which is, I think, the second most recent book by David Mitchell, the man most famous for Cloud Atlas, and also, of course, for being in Peep Show. That's not actually him. Yeah, I read The Bone Clocks. I'm told his novels since Cloud Atlas have been a bit more straightforward and less sort of toying with fantasy elements. Yeah, it's pretty good. I like David Mitchell because I do enjoy a certain amount of literary, but at the end of the day I also like my weird fantasy, so David Mitchell does combine the two in a way that I don't know whether it stops him being accepted by the literary fiction elite. I'm not really in with that crowd, but it does make it very pleasing to me. So yeah, I've pretty much finished it. I've got about 20 pages left. It's very long. It's very, very long. I think for my next book in my renewed commitment to reading, I'm going to do something a bit shorter and a bit less 600 pages of very small text.
So it's a good book? It's engaging? You're enjoying it?
Yeah, it's good. The fantasy elements aren't perhaps quite as well integrated into the rest of the story as they were in Cloud Atlas. There's sort of a very nice, well-observed series of vignettes about everyday life, and then, bang, it suddenly goes really hard into this fantasy element about a war between two rival factions. He's been quite nicely teasing them for most of the book, but when they actually come full circle, it just seems a bit vague, but it does play out the characters quite nicely in the end. Anyway, I shouldn't spoil the end. So yes, it was, even though it was quite long, and therefore it did seem like perhaps a slightly challenging entry to start on, I think a good beginning to be hopefully reading at least more than 5 or 6 books in 2016.
Cool.
It's 2017,
yeah.
Isn't it?
Just having nostalgia for last year.
Why would anyone have nostalgia for last year? I'm not going to re-record that, Bill. I'm just going to have to eat it. Anyway, yes, I have read a book for once. Alastair, what have you been up to?
Well, I've been watching Netflix to make a change in 2017.
Yes, role reversal. Eat it. Sorry.
Is that your new thing, telling people to eat it?
Yeah, I don't know why it's come up twice in a few minutes, but apparently so. But anyway, continue.
So I've been watching Netflix, and the show I've got my teeth into recently is Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency, based on the novel by Douglas Adams of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fame. It's a really good TV show. It's got the kind of craziness of Douglas Adams' sense of humour really well. I know some people are complaining that obviously they've relocated it to America. Most of the cast are American, although they do have a British actor playing the title character, Dirk Gently. They've kept the anarchic sense of humour. It's very funny. It's got really interesting plot, very sort of complicated plot going in lots of different directions. It's one of those things that kind of the first episode throws out about 20 different things. And then I guess as you watch the show, you've got to see how they all connect up and how they're all sort of linked together. And it'll be really impressive if they can draw them all together. But the first episode especially is really, really good for just how it introduces you to the world of the show, but also throws about, like I say, 20 things at you in a very sort of anarchic way and kind of expects you to keep up. But yeah, the way it's all kind of very tightly written, it's very funny, it's very weird. Again, it's got some good people in it, including Richard Schiff, better known as Toby in The West Wing. He's very good. It's good to see him acting again. He does the kind of confused very well.
Yeah, I've never read the books or anything, but I did watch the BBC adaptation a few years back with Stephen Mangan in the title role, and that was quite fun as a sort of quirky detective show, although I'm told by the internet that it was quite a bad adaptation of Dirk Gently, because apparently it was Dirk Gently was a lot more actually surreal rather than just quirky.
Yeah, I mean, they've got the surrealness across quite well in this Netflix adaptation. They've got across that thing of Douglas Adams' writing when pretty much anything could happen at any moment. It always catches you off guard. And they managed to, keep that, especially in the first episode when, something will happen and it will have entirely a different sort of response to or, outcome for what you think it is. So it always keeps you on your toes like that.
Yeah, no, I have heard that's decent. I would like to watch that at some stage.
Also, Elijah Wood is very good. He's kind of the main character, because Dirk Gently isn't really the main character. It's more focused on this guy who kind of gets sucked into Dirk Gently's crazy world, played by Elijah Wood. Again, who's good at doing the straight man in the kind of comedy setup of the kind of the eye rolling and the kind of, oh god, what craziness we've got ourselves into this time.
Yeah, I like how Elijah Wood did the Lord of the Rings films, which are still some of like the biggest films ever, and then rather than going on to become an A-list Hollywood megastar, just seems to have gone back to starring in slightly quirky TV shows.
Yeah, all like low budget films and stuff, which is good. I mean, I guess he must do it because he finds it interesting. I assume he's probably got enough money that he doesn't have to act in these things if he doesn't want to.
Well, yeah, fair enough. Good for him. Okay, first up today, we are doing Silence. Not the comics podcast that I've recommended on here before, and still do, it's very good, but the recent epic historical drama directed by Martin Scorsese and based on the 1966 novel by Shusaku Endo. This is a story about two Portuguese priests, played by Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver, who travel to Japan to find their mentor, who was gone missing, and there were rumours he may have apostatized or renounced his faith, which in this film takes the form of stamping on a tile with a holy image on it. And yes, then they travel through Japan, meeting believers who are forced to practice in secret because it is the 17th century and Christianity is not on in Japan. They go through a whole torturous internal and external spiritual journey. This is a new, serious, historical epic type film. I think it's probably tipped for Oscars at some point. Alastair, what did you think of it?
It's very grim watching. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of sort of detailed examination of religious persecution and outright torture. So it is a heavy, grim film. It's one of those movies that I'm glad that I saw it. I don't know if I necessarily want to see it again, or if I especially kind of enjoyed watching it, but did find it to be quite powerful. It's got a lot of sort of raw emotion in it. I understand this has been something of a passion project for Scorsese. He's wanted to make it for quite a few years. And it really does go into kind of the details of these characters and their faith and how it's affected by the sort of the system at the time in Imperial Japan. So yeah, it's an interesting film. It's definitely got its flaws, which we'll come to in a bit. I don't think it's like as good as some of like Scorsese's best stuff, but it's a very ambitious film. You know, it's very long. It's like 2 hours and 40 minutes, trying to cover a lot in terms of scope. It's certainly a difficult film to sit through. What were your main thoughts?
Yeah, you got to admire the scope and ambition here, the sort of the quiet ambition, I suppose. I mean, whether you get into the territory of admiring it rather than enjoying it, I'm not sure. But yeah, it really is a nearly 3-hour film in which the fundamental question often seems to boil down to, will a priest denounce his faith in order to stop himself from suffering or to stop other Christians from suffering? And if you think that's a really boring or obvious question, like if you just aggressively think, well, obviously he should denounce his faith, why have I just watched 45 minutes of him suffering and looking sad over this question? Then this may not be the film for you.
Or if you think the opposite, I'm sure there are people who say that like you should remain true to what you believe regardless of the cost.
Yeah, I have seen people describe the novel as blasphemous because it kind of, apparently, I guess, I haven't read it, but if it's anything like the film, it does seem to ultimately come down on the side of, yes, obviously the Christian thing to do is to stop people suffering by accepting the need to do this denouncement, even if you don't actually mean it. Even the Japanese, who are trying to make them denounce their faith, are basically saying, look, it doesn't matter, just tread on the damn tile, basically.
Yeah, I can imagine in the book, the way they approach it is much more to do with a character's internal struggle than wrestling with the ideas, you know, inside their head. And obviously that kind of personal conflict, books are very well suited to, but films need something a bit more visual. So the kind of tile stamping thing, I think, does work quite well in that regard.
It works quite well at sort of developing the complexity of it, I guess, in that it starts off with them being back in Portugal, and the two main priests, played by Garfield and Driver, are back in Portugal, and they hear that their mentor, Father Ferreira, has renounced his faith. And of course they hear, oh my god, renounced his faith? They go to Japan to look for him, and it becomes clear that in a lot of cases, their renouncing faith it just means treading on this tile, even when the Japanese are saying, look, it doesn't actually matter. But then again, of course, if it matters to you, if it's your faith, so if it matters to you, it matters to you. But then again, a lot of the time they're doing it to save the lives of themselves or others.
Yeah, and I think the way they're trying to use it is kind of grind people down with these kind of small transgressions to the point when like they stop believing. And it depends actually how far we're going to go into spoilers. I suppose, should we give at this point a spoiler warning?
I guess so, yeah. I mean, I don't know. This isn't a superhero film, but yes.
Yeah. One of the things that did kind of keep me in suspense as I was watching the film was whether or not he would tread on the tile and renounce his faith, him being the Andrew Garfield priest, because they're kind of the two priests sort of get separated. And the film, for the second half, pretty much focuses on Andrew Garfield and the Japanese people who've captured him, trying to break him down and make him renounce his faith. This is where it's going to get slightly spoilery, but it kind of shows how different characters deal with this challenge. The Adam Driver priest decides he'd rather die than renounce his faith. They meet, obviously, the Ferreira figure, played by Liam Neeson, and find out he has renounced his faith and is now living in Japan. But the question is, which the film poses quite well, is, has he really, what does he believe deep down inside? Do we know what he's thinking? Is he still a Christian at heart? And there are moments when he drops hints about that, and it kind of gets to the point that only God really knows what's going on.
Yeah, I must admit, the part where the Andrew Garfield priest, Father Rodriguez, is captured and tortured for what it felt like about an hour and a half. It was probably only about an hour in reality. Well, it was probably much longer for him, but for me. Yeah, that was when the film lost me a tiny bit. It was the part where I really felt like, I'm watching an adaptation of a novel, which might have had a slightly better chance of successfully portraying the inner conflicts of this one man sitting in this cage, being occasionally dragged out to be tortured, or tortured by proxy by watching other people be tortured in a bid to make him apostatize. And yeah, I don't know. I don't know whether this is a limitation of the visual medium or whether it's a limitation of Andrew Garfield as an actor. I don't know. That sequence just did feel a bit sort of repetitive. It didn't really feel like a building of agony. Andrew Garfield seemed to be in roughly the same level of agony throughout, and he just sort of stayed there, and I don't know. I felt like that bit could have been much shorter. But it's a shame, because there was the first, third-ish of the film, basically up to when they got separated. I was really into it at that point. I thought that was a really good little sort of journey through Japan and going through a range of religion-related experiences. Andrew Garfield and Adam Driver meet various local people. Some of them have one reaction to them, some of them have another. They have different approaches to whether they should apostatize when the Japanese come round with this tile and basically get everyone to line up and going, right, stamp on it. And, because you had the two priests, they could then have conversations about what was happening. It was quite nicely sort of dramatised for quite a dry question of faith. After we got to the Father Rodriguez in a cage alone for long, long spells, I must admit it did sort of lose a bit of momentum for me. Once it finally got to the ending of that spell, when Liam Neeson turns up and we get towards what happens next, things picked up a bit, although it did sometimes feel like it was getting into Return of the King-esque too many epilogues territory as well.
The pacing does fall off towards the end. Certainly, I think I agree with you that the bit in the cage, when it's just Father Rodriguez, could have been sort of shorter, is quite long. And also, there is a very long sort of denouement on the end of the film, which I think could have been shorter. It is a long film and maybe could stand to be a bit shorter, although I didn't feel it was terribly paced. It didn't feel like it dragged while I was watching it, at least not too much. I didn't get this feeling of I'm really sort of itching for this to be over, or, at no point did I was I taken out of it to think, God, this is going on for ages.
Yeah, but I did get to a bit of a, is this still going, sort of stage with the cage section, I guess. But yeah, it is a very, obviously Martin Scorsese's been doing this a long time, to put it mildly. And yeah, it's a very nicely made film. It does look lovely. The storytelling is very clear and stylish without being sort of distractingly stylish. The torture isn't particularly visceral. You see enough, and almost there's more shown by sort of withholding it than there would be by showing every breaking bone on screen. But instead, they just make it clear what's happening in a way that leaves it to your imagination exactly how horrible it probably is. The landscapes do look pretty, but he doesn't necessarily linger over them in here's a 10-second long slow shot of a landscape which has no relevance to the plot beyond it's there so you're seeing it.
It's quite an unusual film, I think, partly because of its length, but sort of the way it's made. I think Martin Scorsese is, like you say, he's been around for a while, been making films since the early 1970s. And he was obviously raised on a diet of kind of films from the 40s and 50s. And he is quite, I think, an old-fashioned director, and I don't mean that as a criticism. I mean that his approach is, I think, quite different to a lot of modern directors and how they work. I know, for example, there's a quite illustrative story, which is when Scorsese was making Gangs of New York, they built this enormous set that was kind of included kind of the harbour and the 5 Points area of New York. It's sort of in the period, and they had full-size ships and things like that. And they made it all in Italy, and it was not far from that was where George Lucas at the time was filming Attack of the Clones, which was basically just like, one room and a green screen, and all the acting was done against that, and then everything done with computer graphics. So that's kind of the difference between what, I guess, filmmaking was like and what it's sort of become. So this is a very different movie to even like, modern dramas or historical epics or kind of Oscar films. It's not just that it's different to like modern superhero films. But yeah, I do think Scorsese, his kind of approach is quite old-fashioned, but in some ways that's quite refreshing, because this film is very different to a lot of films you'll see. So, for example, like, it's quite quiet. I mean, obviously it's partly because it's called Silence. Actually, throughout the film, there's several points when it actually uses silence very effectively to sort of underscore the tension or make a dramatic point. But there's not a lot of music in the film. It's slow-paced, but it doesn't drag, and things kind of build over a long period of time through lots of scenes, rather than there kind of being big emotional turning points or kind of conflicts kind of in every scene.
I mean, obviously, if you're a halfway decent writer, this is kind of just necessary, but it does take a sort of non-simplistic view of religion. I think Scorsese is religious himself, I think, based on my token reading around this.
Yeah, he's obviously Italian-American, growing up in a working-class household. Catholicism was, like, I think, a big part of his youth. I believe I read somewhere that Scorsese was actually considering entering the seminary and becoming a priest before his filmmaking took off. So I'm pretty sure he is quite Catholic.
Yeah, but I like the way it did take a sort of a non-simplistic view of religion. The young priests are allowed to look a bit sort of stupid and simplistic when they first arrive with their sort of, why would you ever apostatize? It's a sin, it's wrong, it's not acceptable under any circumstances. I don't think Father Rodriguez, his views on how Japan should just accept Christianity because it's the truth, are meant to come across as fully correct and endorsed by the film. I think he's meant to come across as a bit out of his depth and foolish.
Yeah, or he's kind of very rigid in his beliefs, and sort of doesn't really understand where the other people might believe differently.
Yeah, and the fact that, dealing with being Christian when God is obviously largely silent, that's not really being ignored, it's right there in the title. And there are some odd bits where God appears to be speaking to the lead character. I assume that's meant to be in his head in some way, or maybe God is meant to be a character in the story. They wisely leave it ambiguous.
That's the sort of thing I think that in a book, the ambiguity may have come across slightly better. The sense of, is this in his head or is it really God speaking to him, is something that I guess could have been a bit more ambiguous.
There's a voice, it could be anything, but I don't think it wasn't a specific actor or anything, was it? It wasn't meant to be Liam Neeson's voice, it was just a voice.
Yeah, you're right, it is really good at showing the kind of complexities of the situation, because I was thinking for a while, like, who do we have sympathy with, or who are we supposed to have sympathy with in this film? I mean, on some level, like, I think I have sympathy for the Andrew Garfield character and the other priests, but there is also an element of, like, to some degree they are trying to, like, impose their religion on a different country that has a different culture, and like you say, their justification is, but we're right and you're wrong and you need to accept that. So like, in the kind of root, the complexity of the film is, who do we sympathize with? I mean, like, who did you think you had sort of sympathy with?
Again, this is, an adult film for adults. I don't think you're meant to necessarily have a clear answer to that. I mean, I felt sorry for Andrew Garfield, who is basically suffering in this sort of long religious version of The Revenant. But, he is obviously in some ways a bit foolish and in some ways not really there for always the best of reasons. On the other hand, the Japanese Christians who do seem to sincerely want to be Christians don't really deserve to be burnt on crosses either. So I don't think it's meant to be an easy answer. I don't think Scorsese's coming in and saying, I know the answer to this historical conflict. I think he is explicitly making the point that it is very difficult and confusing. I mean, the main Japanese sort of leader character, the governor, played by Izzy Ogata. Yeah, but he was in some ways a bit of a sadist. His anger did at least seem slightly justified. Also, he seemed to be enjoying himself quite a lot. There was a scene where he seemed to visibly deflate, which was weird as hell, but I quite enjoyed.
Yeah, the actor did a really, really great performance.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even joking about the deflation, by the way. Go and see Silence. It's quite a long way into the film. It's a really great, weird bit of acting, just to take the wind out of the sails of Andrew Garfield during yet another sort of self-righteous rant about Christianity.
Yeah.
The guy just dissolves into his robe. Not in a special effects way either, he just sort of does it.
There's a good bit of acting. I thought that across the board everyone was very good. Andrew Garfield does the kind of pained expression and the kind of the internal anguish very well. Adam Driver does the slightly more, kind of unnuanced, slightly more righteous, I guess, kind of determination of, kind of, no, this is right. Liam Neeson does the broken man very well.
I don't know whether Andrew Garfield entirely nailed the long sequence where it was just him. I kind of feel it was a shame they didn't just, deviate from the source material, which I hear films sometimes do, and just keep the two priests together, rather than basically sidelining Adam Driver for the whole second half of the film. Because I thought having the two of them together to argue about this sort of thing was an interesting way of actually, dramatising it a bit more.
Yeah, I think you're right there, that would have been a good route to go down. It'd been better if he'd had someone to talk to during the kind of the long periods of internal anguish.
As ever, I haven't really been following the Oscar tip section of the world. Have the nominations even come out yet? I don't think so.
No, the nominations come out on the 24th of January.
Okay, so yeah, it's a good few days after this podcast's even released. So, yeah, I don't know whether this is going to sweep the boards at the Oscars. I don't think it won any Golden Globes or anything, did it?
No, I don't think it did. I think it's a good film, but it is flawed in that the emotional kind of core of the film is supposed to be obviously the second part where Andrew Garfield's tested. And although it's good, but it does, I don't know, like say you're right, it doesn't build particularly well. The performance of Andrew Garfield, although it's subtle, it doesn't quite convey the kind of, the full sort of internal anguish of the character. So although this is a good film and certainly a very, we've raised interesting questions and it's well made, it's not quite a knock the ball out of the park, this is amazing, shower it with awards.
Yeah, I mean, it is an interesting meditation on faith, and if you want to see questions of faith tackled respectfully and interestingly, and also with some torture to break them up, then yeah, this is possibly some of the best you'll get in mainstream cinema. I just don't think it's necessarily a flawless movie.
Next, we will be discussing A Monster Calls, based on the novel by Class showrunner Patrick Ness, and starring Felicity Jones and Sigourney Weaver. Connor is a young boy whose mother is dying of cancer. He's visited by a tree monster who tells him cryptic stories that help him deal with his grief. This is a film that I saw at the London Film Festival back in October, which regular listeners will remember that I went to. But now it's out on general release, so we've both had a chance to see it. Nick, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I mostly like this. It's a very, in some ways, quite a conventional weepy film. It's about a kid coming to terms with an oncoming tragedy. And it sits in a strange place. I think it's possibly a bit quiet and slow for a lot of kids. I can imagine if you're in an audience with a lot of kids watching this, they probably get quite restless because it's mostly sort of a long ponder on how this kid is dealing with grief. On the other hand, it's perhaps a bit on the nose and simplistic for adults. There were points where I got a bit frustrated with the monster, the big tree thing, voiced by, again, Liam Neeson, just turning up and basically saying, "And now I shall explain the plot to you." Sometimes even parts that haven't actually happened yet. Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately it probably worked for me on a base emotional level because I am, as I think we discussed in the end of year special, at the end of the day, a big emotional peak. I will make you cry, you fucker. That it is possible to get me with that. And this film does, as I say, it deals with a kid dealing with terminal illness, his mother's terminal illness, played by Felicity Jones of Rogue One fame. And all the sad things you'd expect to happen, and there are lots of emotional moments between the kid and his father, and the kid and his grandma, and the kid and his mum, and the kid and his massive tree monster friend. I cried. I'm probably about the target audience, to be honest. I'm old/pretentious enough to enjoy a slow, thoughtful story, but I still consume a lot of media which is arguably aimed at teenagers, so I didn't get that fucked off by the presence of a massive monster, except during the parts where it started really talking slowly and expositorily. So yeah, not without its flaws, but I did at least buy into the emotion, I think.
Yeah, I thought it was good. Like I say, I agree with pretty much most of what you said. That's a good summary of what the film is like. I thought it was a really good way to use a kind of fantastical story device to explore sort of a conflict more related to our world than a fantasy world. So the film doesn't have a huge degree of ambiguity. Again, we're probably going to go into spoilers here, where from quite early on, even though the kid Connor is visited by like a monster and the sort of his tree at the end of his garden comes to life, it's made quite clear that this is definitely in his head. There's no degree of ambiguity of, is this something that's happening on some level? It's definitely in his head, but obviously Connor sort of escapes into this fantasy plot line about this monster, and it's a good way of articulating his conflict, personal conflict to do with him dealing with the death of his mother. And it also shows, uses the fantasy elements to show really well how the character's thinking and feeling. So although it doesn't go for the kind of, a lot of these things go for an ambiguity, is it real, is it not real? This is very much like a story set in our world about someone with a healthy imagination. But it also, I think that probably helps it make it a bit more accessible to children or younger people. You know, as you were saying, that even though it is quite a story of quite some grown-up complex emotions at its core, the fantasy elements, I think, will help a younger audience connect with it better.
I don't know, it doesn't say really, the audience might be teenagers, but I don't know whether many teenagers would find all the let's talk about our feelings stuff a bit much. I don't know, I don't have any to ask. I mean, Patrick Ness is mostly known as a YA writer, so I guess it is theoretically in that area.
Yeah, I never was exactly sure what age ranges YA is supposed to be. Is it teenagers, or does that include... I guess precocious children read books aimed at people who are older than them.
Well, yeah, I don't know, I liked the fact that it wasn't a simplistic story of, you know, you must accept grief. There's a bit more nuance there. There's some... I don't know, I guess there's the part of why the monster is there. You know, the fact that it's a monster might be a clue. Is that it's tried to help the kid acknowledge and accept not just his grief, but some uglier feelings as well. The kid is allowed to be at times a bit of a dick, and, you know, on a range of levels, because he's trying to process these feelings as well as the death of his mother. And yeah, it does have something to say, I think, even if it does sometimes say it in a slightly over-obvious, here is a massive wooden tree metaphor way.
Yeah.
And yeah, there's a couple of short sequences where the monster tells Connor a story through the means of animation, I guess. There's a few short animated sequences which normally sort of dissolve and interface with the real world in a quite fun way.
Yeah, I thought it was a good example of how to use different mediums, like animation, CGI, and sort of live action, all combined very well.
Yeah, and the monster is a pretty impressive effect, and it's quite slight. I gather it's quite a short book, the original Monster Calls. But then again, if you try to adapt really long books, you can get into slightly slow or crammed territory like Silence did. So yeah, it does, again, perhaps a bit like Arrival, because it's adapting a shorter work, it does feel like it's managing to fit everything in quite comfortably.
Yeah, I certainly thought it was well paced and kind of moved very well from vignette to vignette. Yeah, and I think you're definitely right about how it kind of shows the complex emotions in losing someone. It's not just, like say, grief, there's anger and other emotions sort of mixed in. And also, especially when you're a teenager and a lot of emotions you're feeling for the first time, or you're kind of feeling them with an intensity you never felt before. Teenagers are very kind of emotional people wrapped up in their own emotions, and then it kind of gets that across quite well through exploring kind of, I guess, his personal conflicts, which are illustrated through the fantasy bits. It did cover a lot of complex emotions, especially for, you know, a story that's at least nominally aimed at sort of children or teenagers, in that kind of it's dealing with the worst thing that could happen to a child, you know, losing their mother when they're young. And it does do a good job of showing the emotions involved and kind of making them accessible to the audience.
I guess there are quite a lot of cuddly monsters in pop culture nowadays. And the fact that this monster just turns up at first and just talks to him and tells him little stories does perhaps at first catch you off guard before you work out that it is there because there are some genuinely ugly emotions under the surface. I think it's quite nicely played. I think the kid playing Connor, Lewis McDougall, is very good as well. I think he portrays the complexity quite well. I think, you know, good work on not casting a rubbish child actor.
Yeah.
I enjoyed the bit where Liam Neeson, who voices the monster, I'm pretty sure shows up in some family photos as the kid's departed grandfather.
Oh, I didn't notice that. That's well done. So is that the husband of Sigourney Weaver, I suppose? Because she plays his grandmother, yeah.
Yeah, whose husband I assume is dead because he's not in it. But there's a couple of photos in the background of Sigourney Weaver and Liam Neeson.
Yeah, because she has like a room in her house which I think belonged to her husband that she doesn't want to go into because she's still grieving for the loss of her husband when she's now got to face the loss of her daughter, which is again the worst thing that can happen to a parent, is to have to bury their child.
Yeah, Sigourney Weaver's good in this as well. A fairly typical journey, I guess, in that, you know, the grandmother sort of substitute parent figure at first seems cold and distant and not warm, and then the child slowly comes to realise that they ultimately feel the same horrible feelings, and then they eventually bond. In some way, it's not a complex or unpredictable story, and as I say, it could at times do without the monster just telling you what you should feel, but it is very affecting, I found. I cried in the cinema. I saw it with former podcast guest Julianne Benford, who I think also admitted to crying in the cinema at a couple of bits. So yeah, if you want to cry in the cinema, this is definitely a good film to see.
It's a good weepy film. Yeah, like you say, down to some great performances. Like you say, the kid playing Connor is good. You know, I thought Felicity Jones was amazing as playing the mother, and it's kind of slowly disintegrating throughout the film and kind of getting across the slow process of being ground away and sort of losing the battle to cancer. She did illustrate that very well, and obviously trying to put a brave face on it for her son, but falling apart a bit herself.
Yeah, I mean, Felicity Jones is good. A lot of the adult figures ultimately are sort of reduced in a sense to how they impact on Connor. It's one of those films where everything's from the kid's perspective, so the child viewer may not necessarily care that much about what the adults' lives are like, but, the film, as the better ones of these films do, gives you enough information in sort of, like, in overheard conversations and snippets and stuff, that the adult viewer can piece together an idea of what these adults' lives are like as adults.
Yeah.
It does do that well. I mean, Felicity Jones is obviously trying to hold it together for the child, but I guess as watching it as an adult viewer and trying to think of what her life is actually like, it does, she's clearly sort of falling apart a bit. It does just make it all the sadder.
They do nail that note of sadness and kind of how upsetting the subject matter is really well. I never felt they took it too far. Like, I never felt I was being emotionally exploited. You can feel sometimes these films, they're kind of yanking your emotions around. It's kind of like, oh, we've got like a kid losing his mother. Like, I'm going to like basically use that to kind of just emotionally manipulate you, because by itself it is such an emotional topic. But I didn't feel the film kind of exploited us emotionally. It just kind of told this kind of very sweet, sad story. So yeah, it's not maudlin. It's not just sort of like sad in like an emotionally exploitative way. It's just got a quiet, sad little story to tell, and it tells it very well. Yeah,
but I mentioned that at times the monster does get a bit overly expository, but on the other hand, the fact that the monster usually turns up every few minutes to go, and now I shall take you through the next stage of the plot, does at least keep you on the plot. There aren't that many sequences where you're just staring at the characters going, look, it's sad, isn't it sad? Look at the sadness. Stare hard at the sadness until you cry. Yeah, the monster is there to go, no, this is a plot structure. I will guide you through the plot structure, sometimes slightly overtly, but still, it does actually keep the film moving.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. And having that fantasy element and using it to kind of dramatise the characters' personal conflicts is, exactly what stops it being like ridiculously sad or maudlin, yeah.
Again, much like Silence, it's not perfect, but I don't know. I mean, if we're evaluating these films on which one comes closer to hitting their target, then I would admit A Monster Calls might actually win over Silence. I don't know. I mean, comparing these films is bullshit, just to be clear. They're not comparable films, really. But I suspect A Monster Calls probably comes closer to achieving its personal goals.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It certainly does tell, like, it's sort of straightforward, but, like, complex. Well, it's plot-wise straightforward, emotionally complex story, very well and very subtly and adaptedly. Like I say, it's not perfect, but it does really kind of do what it set out to do really well. And I can't think of any like major flaws with it. I was very impressed.
Yep, cool. Again, I don't know if this is scheduled to be showered with awards, but I won't be surprised if it sneaks one or two here or there. It's a decent film.
Might do well. It's the sort of thing I think would do better at the BAFTAs and the Oscars. It's kind of probably a bit too fantasy for the Oscars to take it seriously, but this is the sort of thing that the BAFTAs tend to be a bit more open-minded about this sort of thing.
Good luck on Monster Calls. Okay, now it's time to talk about the end of Series 4 of Sherlock. I know it's only been one episode since we last covered it, but of course, only a 3-episode series. So it's all over already. We've had the last 2 episodes, The Lying Detective and The Final Problem. And that may well be it for Sherlock as an ongoing TV show, who knows. So yep, we've seen the final 2 episodes, we're going to talk about them. Obviously, when we do these sort of end-of-series wrap-ups, we sort of feel we might as well do spoilers, or you kind of wonder what the point is in covering it again. Here we go then, full spoilers, the last 2 episodes of Sherlock Series 4. Alastair, what did you think?
Well, at this point, I think the flaws of Sherlock are well documented, not the least by us in our previous episode.
Well, yeah, let's try not to repeat ourselves too much.
No, exactly. But it wasn't very good. It is somewhat disappointing that the writers sort of keep making the same mistakes over and over. But the problem with the remainder of Series 4 is that it's all plot. It's kind of overloaded with gotcha twists, kind of twists that sort of nonsensical, don't really contribute much to the plot other than to needlessly upend it to make it more confusing and serve just to basically show you something you've not anticipated, but you don't make the story make any more sense or redefine it. So there's just a lot of twists that just seem to be there to catch the audience out. The tension seemed quite artificial. The plot was sort of rambly, didn't really have a focus. There wasn't like a case that was built around.
Yeah, see, I thought the last 2 episodes at least had decency to be different. I mean, I actually thought the second episode of Series 4 was actually quite good. For the most part, by modern Sherlock standards. I thought it had a plot, it had a villain, it didn't overwank itself too much. The twists at the end I thought were actually earned based on what was going on. Toby Jones is very, very good. And yeah, definitely the most I've enjoyed Sherlock since the Series 1 and 2 glory days, to be honest.
Yeah, I think of the 3 episodes in this series, the second one was the best. And because it's the one that sort of suffered the least from Sherlock's flaws, in that this one was a kind of a contained plot that wasn't struggling to advance about 5 or 6 different arc plots at the same time. It had a sort of a case they were trying to resolve, a sort of self-contained story. You say there were twists that were earned. They made sense. They didn't just confuse the plot. They added to it in some way. Although the twists that sort of added to the overall plot of the entire series were just kind of adding layers of confusion on top of layers of confusion.
I don't know, I was quite impressed by that at the time at the end of episode 2. The fact that it was the same woman in various wigs and makeup and changes of how she acted was something I hadn't spotted, and something that I thought did make me think, oh, that's clever, rather than, oh, for God's sake, as twists in Sherlock sometimes do. So I didn't really mind that at the time.
No, I suppose that was good. I liked the second episode. As you said, Toby Jones was good. The plot did hold together. I mean, generally I think I've found every series since the first one, the middle episode has been the most interesting, kind of the best one.
Just to be clear, when you say since the first one, are we admitting that the middle episode of series 1 is kind of bollocks?
Yeah, that was the weak one in series 1, was the middle episode. But in series 2, 3 and 4, the middle one being, well, they did The Hound of the Baskervilles. There's one when Watson got married.
I am quite fond of the Reichenbach fall in series 2. Baskervilles was good as well. I'm not going to go hard in on that one.
But yeah, those are kind of my favourites, and it's usually because in the middle of the series it kind of takes a break from the arc plot to tell a kind of self-contained story that kind of have twists that sort of contribute, but sort of function a bit separately.
It was still kind of latter-day Sherlock in that it was very much about the characters and about Sherlock and Watson in a lot of ways, but it actually kind of made it work because the way it tied into the characters was sort of revealed at the end in a way that didn't, massively change the course of the episode. It wasn't like in the first one of this series where you find out the whole Thatcher's thing is actually about Sherlock. Well, about Mary technically, but that just makes it about Sherlock. Yeah, I was for the most part quite sold on the second one. I think it's definitely has its flaws, but I thought it hung together very well in itself. But I must admit, I'm not going to defend the third one quite as hard. That had some problems.
They seem to throw out a lot of stuff, like the whole bit with when it starts with the plane. Like that was, I don't think, really particularly satisfactorily resolved. How there's this plane and it's going to crash unless Sherlock who's talking to the only person on the plane is a child who Sherlock's talking to on the phone, and he's trying to sort of resolve the situation, maybe find some way that the kid could safely land the plane. And then the revelation at the end, though, is that there is no plane. It was just inside his sister's head.
Yeah, it was his sister doing another funny voice, I guess, which I guess she has established as being able to do. It's probably not a huge surprise that Eros can impersonate a child on the phone, but it was still a bit of a weird twist.
Yeah. But I don't think it was a satisfactory resolution. It was very much kind of showing you something, leading you to believe something, and then just snatching it away, as if to say, see, I convinced you that was real. Well, yes. If you're going to play like that, then we're going to doubt that everything is real.
I don't know. I was expecting there to be more to that. I mean, the fact that they were sort of playing around with not telling you the kid's name, it was always going to be a bit... I mean, I sort of assumed it was Eros when I first saw the child. Then I started to think it wasn't, and then, of course, it was. Yeah, the plane wasn't what massively put me off that episode. I was sort of with it for about the first... I didn't actually watch the clock when I was watching it, but I think about the first 40 minutes, maybe an hour. And then that really long sort of walking through the labyrinth section started, and that really did sort of stop the episode dead for me. It's just, I know this is the sort of thing that always sounds really good when you're a writer alone in a room thinking, right, well, I'm going to put them in a locked room with no features or anything, and they're going to make these really stark moral choices with no distractions. It's like, yeah, that's always a lot more fun to theorise about than to actually watch, I'm afraid. And so it was this time.
It felt very much that they were manufacturing artificial tension. They were just like...
That was the point, wasn't it? That's literally what Euros was doing in the name of science or something vague. I mean, it's not as if they were pretending this was happening accidentally. They'd introduced the Joker-like sister who was then going to put them through these arbitrary trials.
Yeah, you say this looks good on paper, but it's just not very good. I kind of felt that there was just a kind of hollowness to the whole thing. But it shouldn't be hollowness to a story in which a character is kind of confronted by their long-lost sister and has to make moral choices involving their brother and their closest friend. But it just wasn't particularly good, and I can't really put my finger on why.
Well, it just wasn't particularly entertaining. I mean, I think it's meant to be sort of stark, breaking it down to its purest essence, or the characters to their purest essence. But it just kind of makes it kind of bone dry. I mean, I felt a little flicker of, the scene with Sherlock and Molly on the phone was properly sad. Like, Louise Brealey, who plays Molly, really acted the shit out of it. It was in a sort of small way. It was quite a heartbreaking scene, but I don't know. I feel like they could have maybe surely you could have got that scene and managed a whole episode without just going, and then they'll put them in this weird torture maze and then just walk them slowly through it. It's just, I don't know, maybe one Doctor Who puzzle would have worked. By the time we got to 4 or 5, however many it was, even if we got the occasional good bit, like I quite liked Mark Gatiss' performance as Mycroft, especially in that bit where Euros was trying to get Sherlock to shoot one of them. It was a nice bit. As ever with Sherlock, if nothing else, there's a reliable conveyor belt of nice bits every so often. But I don't know, the connecting tissue bit just rang a bit hollow for me. As I say, it's clearly meant to be very stark and on the nose, but it's just a bit it's nothing to it. It's just walking and Euros bleating this sort of psycho-babble or science babble over and over again in a slightly samey way.
Yeah.
It was just slightly boring, which is unfortunate because it took up about, I don't know, it felt like longer, but I think it was about 45 minutes of the episode in the end.
Yeah, it was kind of the main thrust of the plot. Yeah, and then they kind of end up at their house at the end, which I believe was supposed to burn down. And then there was, like, again, more bits there, and then, it just... He had another sort of gotcha twist on top of everything else when they revealed that his dog, which died when he was young, was actually just his friend. There's no way you can anticipate any of this stuff. I don't really see what it adds to the plot other than just kind of like... It seems like, like a very artificial inflating. I mean, I didn't feel anything particularly... any strong emotions or anything like that. I just felt a kind of... just more like completely exacerbated at that point. That kind of like... the whole thing keeps changing all the time. Like nothing is like permanent or concrete. There's like... everything you try to grasp in Sherlock just kind of changes into something else. After a while, it's kind of, it's quite clever. After a while, it's sort of, I don't know, it's quite frustrating.
It answered the sort of the weird unspoken question, I guess, of, why does this dog matter so much? Which you sort of nigglingly think, why are they making so much of this dog? And the answer, of course, is because it's not a dog, it's a boy who Euros killed, which in turn goes back to explain why Euros was sent away and stuff. Because even if she had, hidden a dog and then burnt down a house, you'd still think she'd just go to normal prison. But it fills in blanks and it makes the whole thing fall into place, and I did feel bad for Sherlock a bit when he discovered it, because, again, Benedict Cumberbatch is quite good at the acting. But... yes, it didn't add that much. It's not as if they're going to explore the ramifications of it much.
Yeah. I just would have preferred Sherlock to be a bit more like traditional Sherlock Holmes, based around Sherlock trying to solve a mystery. I got the feeling they want it to be as this slick sort of spy drama, I think we said before, but it's kind of full of intrigue and twists.
Yeah, like they're on a prison island that's been taken over by the baddie, and now they're going to put them through a labyrinth of weird shit. It was a bit... yeah. I mean, I don't want to reference Batman again, but it was kind of a bit Batman.
Or a bit Bond villain or something.
Oh, a bit Bond villain, yeah. It was... as I say, moment to moment, some fun bits. It was kind of nice to see Moriarty again.
Again, they trailed Moriarty being back. I felt that was quite unsatisfactorily dealt with. So it was just that he'd recorded a few things for Euros to use, just recorded some videos that she'd been sort of plaguing Sherlock with. But I don't really understand why or for what purpose, why either of them did it or what it really added. Just like the bit when she flies a grenade into their Baker Street flat through the window. I mean, it's a good tense scene when they're working out what they're going to do before the grenade explodes. But I'm not really sure how that's supposed to work in the context of the story, because Euros isn't trying to kill them. She wants to put them in her maze to give them the weird moral test. So why did she just try to outright kill them in the first place? After spending so much time in the previous episode trying to kind of infiltrate their lives.
I don't know, because in her weird Sherlockian way she knew they wouldn't actually die, I guess. That's usually the explanation, isn't it?
Yeah, but I don't think the show plays fair with the audience, is the simplest way of putting it. They're you can trick the audience by constantly changing and switching everything, but there is an element of, if you constantly, if you don't play fair, people will eventually just stop wanting to play your game.
Yeah, I don't know, as I say, I didn't mind the opening chunk of the third one, and I didn't even mind the ending chunk that much. For me, it was mostly just killed by the really momentum-sapping walk through the labyrinth. That fucked it for me. I mean, they could have just had it be a chase around London. I guess they might feel they've done that. I think both the Moriarty episodes in Series 1 and 2 were basically, let's have a chase around London.
Yeah.
If it might be their final episode, I'd almost kind of rather they just, lent into the nostalgia and revisited it, to be honest.
Yeah, that would have probably been better. I think when they got to the island, I kind of lost patience with it, because I realised this is just going to be now a big sort of drawn out showdown.
The thing is, if it is their finale, or at least their finale of it as an actual regular TV show, which it could be. I mean, there's an extent to which that kind of buys you a certain amount of, disappearing up your own arse. It's your last episode. Yeah, why not bring back some old characters? That Moriarty cameo is exactly the sort of thing you do in your last episode for a bit of, pay remember me self-indulgence. That's why I'm kind of inclined to let them get away with it, to be honest.
But they did trailer his return so heavily, and, from the end of the last series, and it was pretty disappointing.
They did say in the Victorian special, at the end, fairly clearly, he's not alive, he's dead, and they have pretty much stuck with that.
Yeah, no, I like that. At least they didn't bring him back from the dead, because at that point you'd be like, in that case, nothing in Sherlock is permanent or what it sees.
There was a bit of a lack of payoff in that, Moriarty's involved with Euros in the past, fair enough. As I say, I'm willing to let them, throw in a slightly convoluted excuse just to get Moriarty back on screen again, because, it is TV. It's a medium for visuals and actors, and he is a fun thing to have on screen. But, yeah, it would have been nice if they'd been able to come up with a slightly bigger thing for him to contribute than just, recording some voiceover. That bit probably doesn't hold together that well. I mean, sure, there we go. If that is the end of Sherlock, then it was fun for a couple of years, and then it went a bit up itself.
I think that is a good place to leave it, because it does they kind of resolve the plot, put the characters into a state of equilibrium. You could kind of understand that they keep doing that forever or whatever.
Well, yeah, I mean, like all British shows, it seems, all successful British shows seem to just disappear in the end into this sort of stuttering every so often they do a special, and at least they've left them somewhere they could easily do a special without having to spend half of that special undoing the ends of the last series.
Yeah, they didn't try to do something kill off the main characters or anything at the end.
And if it's only one-off special, maybe they can, contain themselves and actually do a one-off special.
Yeah, that will hopefully make it more like the middle episode in that being a self-contained story. Yeah, it's just they seem to believe in their own infamy a bit too much, and that everything's about Sherlock and sort of Sherlock's identity and question of who is Sherlock Holmes and what made him the way he is. Whereas, I don't know, Sherlock Holmes isn't, although he's an interesting and captivating character, it's usually, what's interesting about him is the mysteries he's in and how he unravels them, not necessarily just him as a person.
Well, yeah, how is the clever man and clever, and why is he also quite miserable? The answer to those questions often comes worryingly close to just because he is. You can point to a few childhood traumas and a few little demonstrations of how clever he is, but it doesn't matter that much. I mean, House ran for 8 seasons and never explained the lead character's pain that much beyond one episode's flashback to him getting injured and a couple of bits about how his dad was a bit of a dick.
Yeah, that's really all you need, because again, House very much structured around Macy's interesting mysteries, trying to work out what it was. But even though House was one that could, obviously you knew, for example, any time they suggest something early in the episode is the solution, it never is. House sometimes can be accused of kind of waving something in front of the audience and taking it away from them, just for the purpose of, to increase the tension. But there was at least, I think, a sense that they did play fair with the audience. They had a set of rules and they sort of stuck to them. You get the feeling almost anything could happen in Sherlock.
Well, House was medical mysteries, so as a non-doctor, it was pretty much always, oh, that's the answer, is it? I could never have guessed that.
Yeah.
So to that extent, it and Sherlock have always felt weirdly similar.
Yeah, I guess they are similar in that way, but the Sherlock ones, I don't know, it strayed a bit too far from what it once had that made it interesting.
I'm glad they got one more episode I genuinely liked without that many qualifications out before finishing. But yeah, it's a shame they couldn't also actually finish on a good one as well. The last one was, as you say, felt a bit hollow and a bit, I don't know, a bit much less than the sum of its parts, sadly.
Yeah, it's very much the issue with it, yeah. Although it's got some good scenes, the scenes never kind of connect into a whole that has much integrity. You can get a good scene, and then it moves on to something else that's not very good, or there's good scenes, but like you say, the overall is less than its parts, so it kind of makes you feel almost like they were cheating you when they were making you like it for a few minutes, because the whole thing doesn't work. So therefore, the bits when you actually were engaged or interested in the characters, you felt a bit like you were cheated. For example, the opening of the third episode of this series, when it's kind of Mycroft in his home, kind of being stalked by some sort of, presence. And it is quite tense and stuff, and there's quite a lot of, there's a lot of tension in that scene. It's quite scary, it's quite creepy. I was kind of really thinking, oh, this is good, this is interesting. And obviously it's revealed to be barely relevant to the plot, just sort of window dressing on the opening. And kind of all the tension that you'd built up there was no tension because Mycroft was never threatened. It was just Sherlock all along, and you felt that I become emotionally invested in something and actually engaged with it. And it turned out to be nothing that I thought it was, in a slightly cheap way. And, and then I just felt almost foolish or or cheated a bit for actually getting invested in liking the story.
That's a sort of standard TV trick nowadays, isn't it? I mean, yes, that's a fairly egregious example, but you think it's this, but it's actually this. You think it's a ghost, but it's actually a Halloween costume. You think the thing is taking place in one thing, but it's actually somewhere else. It's. I mean, admittedly, Sherlock does do it a lot to the point where you kind of wish it would space it out a bit so it has more impact. But yeah,
there's nothing wrong with having twists. They have to be well executed, and I think it just kind of overloads itself with too many over-the-top twists.
Yeah. No, well, it's not as if our opinions on their future direction really matter, because, as we've said, I'm not sure it has one.
No. Well, I guess there's a reasonable point to leave it with. I don't feel like there was any plot left hanging that I would want returned to.
No, I think unlike the last two series, I think that was definitely an effort to go, right, it's all tied up in a neat little bow. All the dangling plots are, for once, actually resolved, which, after the last couple of series, was kind of nice. In fact, they ended on a massive cliffhanger in Series 1 as well, didn't they? That whole swimming pool thing. So yeah, this is the first time they've actually ended a series of Sherlock. Well done, guys.
So it would be a nice place to leave it at. They could do another special. It leaves both options open. But I wouldn't feel aggrieved if that was the last episode.
Yeah, but I don't know. I think they made a lot in, particularly in this fourth series, of how, the characters have advanced factually. Sherlock's a bit more willing to be warm and have friends than he was at the start of the show. They're a family in a sort of slightly more overt way. There is, I think, an effort, obviously, particularly in this episode, to show that things have progressed and this is the point they're leaving on. This is the arc the characters have been on since the start of Series 1. So, yeah, as I say, I think they drew a line under whatever that was.
Yeah. So it seems like a reasonable point to end on.
Indeed it does. Does that mean we're ending on it as well?
There's only one way of life, and that's your own.
Last time, I recommended that Nick listen to Levelling the Land, the second and probably the best album from folk punk group The Levellers. This was the album of my early 20s, and it's no exaggeration to say it's still one of my favourite albums of all time. With that in mind, Nick, what did you think?
Yeah, unfortunately, it's very much my sort of thing. It's at the slightly folkier end of the folk punk intersection, sort of catchy, fun, angry without being screamy. I can, this may well make me softcore, but I can enjoy a certain amount of shouting in my music as long as it remains shouting without verging too far into actually screaming. There's a jolly bit of fiddling here and there. Yeah, I really like this. It does go very much in the sort of the Frank Turner Pogues area of my interests, which is fine. That's one of my favourite types of music.
Yeah, it's definitely, you're right, that is definitely the nexus of where it is. To put it in sort of context a bit, so there was Fairport Convention. I think we were kind of the first band to kind of mix folkiness with they did folk music, but with electric guitars, I think was their innovation, rather than acoustic. And then there's various bands that are put together. So, like, say, the Pogues, as you mentioned, obviously the synthesis of punk music and Irish folk music. The Levellers are kind of the synthesis of English folk music with punk. Yeah, and I say Frank Turner's very much in that area. I mean, when I was at university, I went to Preston Students' Union to see Frank Turner supporting the Levellers.
Wow.
Now, I don't think the Levellers could open for Frank Turner because he's huge. And although the Levellers still have a hardcore core fan base that still reliably turn up to their gigs, I don't think they're quite as popular as they once were.
No, I mean, to be honest, I didn't know the Levellers that well beyond What a Beautiful Day, is it? The one song they had that did go wide for a bit.
That's on a later album. I think it's on Mouth to Mouth or Zeitgeist. It's one of the ones that couple after Levelling the Land. I mean, they were like a bigger deal in the early 90s. Like, their album Zeitgeist, I think their fourth album was a number one album. Got to the top of the album charts. Like I say, Beautiful Day was quite a big single. It got onto Now Records and Shine Records, if you remember those music compilation CDs. I used to buy those, yeah. And yeah, there was usually like one side would be pop and one side would be like indie. I think Shine was a bit more indie leaning.
My sister used to buy those, I think. I think it was Hits she used to buy. There was like Hits 97 and Hits 98 and Hits.
Yeah, there was that, and there's like Now and Shine and a few others. But yeah, so the Levellers were on, they were on one of those. They headlined Glastonbury at one point in the 90s. Back then, Glastonbury was more of the hippie festival that it started out as, and less of the kind of commercial kind of fuckstorm that it is now. But they were like a big thing, and I think they really did kind of grab the zeitgeist grab the zeitgeist, because it's one of the albums is called Zeitgeist, of the early 90s, that kind of surge of like environmental activism and huge amount of disaffection with the kind of over 10 years of Tory rule at that point.
I mean, I think, to be honest, a lot of the appeal of What a Beautiful Day was more that it was catchy and an upbeat, shouty song than because of any political statement, to be honest. I think it's probably no coincidence that was their big semi-breakthrough, semi-hit.
Yeah. I mean, because the thing about the Levellers is, what really attracted me to them in my early 20s was like the politics as well as the music. They are a good lefty, right-on band.
I think the combination of the sort of the overt leftiness and the sort of perhaps the fact that there are quite a few songs where they go a bit more sort of fiddly, folky might have stopped them ever breaking through and becoming a major thing. I don't know.
Yeah, I guess the songs, because they do kind of move back and forth. Some of them are more punk ones, like One Way of Life is, for example, is a bit much more of a punk song, whereas like something like The Boatman or The River Flow are a bit, kind of a bit more melodic and folky.
I don't know what the singles were off this album, or whether there were any songs from this that did impact the charts at all. One Way seems quite sort of catchy and akin to What a Beautiful Day, I guess. I felt like if a song was going to break through from this album, it would probably have been that.
Yeah, One Way is the song that endures. People know that, partly because it's such a great, iconic opening to an album. But there's a lot of really good ones. I think the first one I really got into was Sellout, which is the kind of about the middle of the album. That was a really, really good.
Well, the slightly angrier one.
Yeah, in a sort of vague political way. Like some of the songs are like lean more towards folk, some more towards punk, and some are in the middle. Like the politics as well. Some of them are like Another Man's Cause, which is about the Falklands War, or Battle of the Beanfield, which is about the Battle of the Beanfield. Are like specifically political songs about specific events with a message. But then there's other songs that are like One Way of Life, The Boatman, or Sellout, that are just kind of vaguely political, and they're stabbing at like ideas and emotions that a lot of people who share these politics feel, but they're not about one specific thing.
Yeah, I mean, I quite liked The Boatman. I think it stood out the first time I listened, perhaps because a lot of the songs do hit a vaguely similar sort of upbeat, folky tempo, and The Boatman is one of the songs that drastically changes it.
Yeah, The Boatman it's hard to choose a favourite one, but The Boatman is definitely a strong candidate. I do really like that song. Partly because like it's got that enormous didgeridoo solo on the end as well.
Yeah, I don't know, I did struggle to choose a favourite song, to be honest. Partly because, I don't think this is exactly a criticism, but there is a level of sameness to it, in that I had to actually work out exactly which song was which. I had to listen to it very carefully with an eye on the track list. There was the extent to which songs didn't, except for the couple that drastically changed the style, like The Boatman. I didn't necessarily know exactly which song was which the first time I listened, or even the third time I listened.
Yeah, you'd have to listen to it more to kind of get the flavour of each individual track.
But yeah, the last song, The Battle of the Beanfield, was good, which was nice. It's always good where albums don't turn shit at the end.
Yeah.
And 15 Years is good as well. And yeah, they do like a good chorus repeat, don't they? There's a few songs that do just shout the chorus to fade to a degree that sometimes seems a bit, this is going on a bit. But yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know, I suspect it would be, absolutely awesome if I'd been there at a gig and they'd been, everyone's been yelling the chorus again and again. But on the record, I probably didn't need those, 6 repeats at the end of One Way.
I suppose it is more of the way it's pitched for the live show.
It is quite raw by recorded album standards. I'm sure they are a very good live band.
Yeah, that's the thing. The gigs are amazing, the Levellers gigs, in that there's a really, really great atmosphere, especially now because it's kind of, they have their, hardcore fans that, really love their stuff and turn up regularly. Especially, like the Brixton Academy and stuff, which is, in London there seems to be enough Levellers fans scattered across the southeast to pack out Brixton Academy, which is pretty good. And there's in Levellers gigs, obviously there's lots of singing along, there's lots of people kind of moshing and going crazy, but also further back people doing folk dancing and stuff.
So I went to see the Pogues once, and it was much like that.
Yeah, and it's a very similar atmosphere to the Pogues. Yeah,
except their frontman of the Levellers can presumably still actually speak.
Yeah, that's the thing. The main guy, it's kind of, there isn't one kind of person who's the lead, in the same way that the Pogues is just sort of built around Shane MacGowan and that amazing singing voice he has, and certainly a very iconic singing voice. Was the Levellers have kind of there's 2 sort of different people who sing, and there's they have about 3 people playing guitar. There's the really cool fiddle guy with his enormous dreadlocks.
Yeah, I must admit I haven't actually watched any videos or done any research, so I didn't actually spot that there were 2 different people singing. But I can imagine it being very good live.
Yeah, they are. I think they're touring. When is it? 25 years of Levelling the Land. They're doing a tour to celebrate now.
Are you going?
I might do. I haven't decided. This is trivia for our audience about my future schedule.
Yeah, if you want to follow Alastair around, then he might be at the London gig in the Levelling the Land tour.
Yeah.
Go get him, guys.
Yeah. One thing I think about, because the Levellers, obviously, I do really like the music because of the politics, but I do get a sense that indie music used to be more political. I mean, like, not just the Levellers. I mean, like, the Manic Street Preachers, very left-wing band, and were, like, big bands, you know, releasing number one singles, huge following. I kind of felt that, like, that kind of political agitation has kind of gone out of indie music. I mean, the last musician to make some kind of serious political impact, I think, was, like, Charlotte Church, the pop singer, but it's like the mantle of being a political agitator has seems to pass from indie music to pop music.
Honestly, I'm not really familiar enough with the current indie scene to make sweeping statements about whether it's political or not. I mean, the period when I was vaguely familiar with indie music, sort of, I guess, late 90s to 2000s, I guess there was a vague feeling that was sort of our comfortable middle class period where everything was broadly okay. We didn't need to worry too much about politics and stuff, so bands didn't, by and large, talk about it that much. I mean, Block Party used to talk a bit about the plight of the sort of second generation immigrants, but I think that was more from a personal perspective than a let's talk about legislation perspective.
Yeah. I suppose, yeah, I mean, just goes to show how much things have changed over time. But there was, I suppose, that 90s, I guess there was that kind of enthusiasm born out of the kind of desperation and hatred of the long-standing Tory government that actually led to some enthusiasm of people who felt like, you know, things can change, we can have a better world, which I guess, you know, fueled into sometime more general sense of cultural optimism through Britpop, or specifically people getting into political bands like the Levellers or the Manics, or, you know, people voting for Tony Blair.
Are we blaming Britpop for this? We say Britpop showed indie music, it doesn't actually have to be about anything other than observational stuff and angst.
I guess so. It is all Britpop's fault.
I still love Blur, sorry.
Yeah, I still love Oasis.
Well, one day we'll have that out on the podcast, but probably not right now.
Yeah, but right now we're united in our appreciation of Levelling the Land. It's definitely their best album, although they do have some other really good ones. The first album, A Weapon Called the Word, is more folky and more protesty. Like, every song on that album is like a protest song. This one brings in other things, like they've got a kind of hippie spirituality sort of thing running through it, also running through their music, and there's kind of more of that in Levelling the Land. They kind of, again, do combine the sort of raw anger of punk, sort of politically, and the kind of spirituality, sort of vague sort of spirituality of a kind of the hippie sort of folk music. And yeah, this album is a really good synthesis of that. But they did make some other good ones after. Like the third album, which is just self-titled, Levellers, is very good, as is later albums like Zeitgeist and Mouth to Mouth.
Are they still making new albums, or are they just banging out the hits at this stage?
They're really overdue a new album. The last album was 2012, Static on the Airwaves. I think they've released some live albums and stuff since then.
In my experience of following sort of long-standing indie bands, there is a risk that sometimes they do seem to just go into, should we record a new album or should we just tour and bang out the hits? I don't know. As a long-standing Ash fan, the gaps between albums are definitely getting longer.
The later albums aren't as good as the early ones. But I mean, they've all got like, Static on the Airwaves had some great songs on it. Letters from the Underground from 2008, again, has some, you know, a few really, really good, you know, songs on it. But the best stuff is from that early 90s period, from Weapon Called the Word in 90 through to sort of 97, Mouth to Mouth. Those albums are really good, and 5 of them went gold, so they in the UK, so they were popular.
Yeah, as I say, I know they had their brief moment in the sun, but yeah, apparently they're maybe too political or too folk, or just not catchy enough to follow Frank Turner into the mainstream.
Yeah,
I must admit, it's been a couple of albums since Frank Turner has last massively wowed me.
He's got less political the more popular he's got as well.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I mean, from what little I know of his personal politics, he's vaguely libertarian, isn't he?
Yeah, he's a left libertarian, which is a sort of, I don't know, a strange ideology. The people at Kraken did a good episode on libertarianism in which they tore into how being a left libertarian isn't really a thing, or it's just a stupid position to hold. So rather than making this a big kind of discussion of political science, I refer you to the Kraken episode about libertarianism, because that's a great podcast about politics.
Okay, but yes, Levelling the Land. Yes, good album. It will probably stay on my rotation of music to listen to.
It's really good. It's one of my favourite albums. I'm glad you liked it. It's very cool. If you do like that, or if anyone else out there is inspired, certainly check out this album and their other albums. Like the ones from that period there's a lot of great stuff on all those kind of early 90s Levellers albums.
Yeah, no, I mean, I must have said this about, what are they called? The
Half Man,
Half Biscuit as well, and I never got around to it. But yes, I should check out some of the other albums as well. It does, as I say, sound like it's very much in my area.
If I could choose the life if I please, then I would be a boatman.
Well, I'm glad you liked Levelling the Land. It was certainly good for me to revisit it. So, for the next episode, what will you be recommending to me?
Bit of a departure from the normal. I'm going to recommend you a film from the 90s, in fact, which I saw when I was at university. So yeah, this is very much one of your recommendations I'm doing, isn't it? But anyway, this is the 1995 version of Richard III, directed by Richard Loncraine and starring Ian McKellen in the main role, backed up by Annette Bening, Jim Broadbent and Robert Downey Jr.
Oh, cool.
So yeah, it's based, of course, on the Shakespeare play of the same name, the massive tragedy, but this is rooting it more in, I guess, 30s Germany Nazi iconography, to be honest. It's quite a famous adaptation, and I think it was one of the things that propelled Ian McKellen to fame among sort of Shakespeare-liking people before he was propelled to general fame as Magneto. So yeah, it's a really, really good film. I saw it at university when I was doing a module on Shakespeare adaptations. It is probably my favourite Shakespeare adaptation. It's one of the only ones I've actually bought on DVD and kept up with. I've actually watched more than once for fun. It's really, really good. I look forward to discussing it.
I've wanted to see this version for years. I mean, it's very iconic, sort of Richard III with Ian McKellen. So I'm really looking forward to this.
Well, yeah, it's quite hard to get hold of. I can confirm the DVD version I've got is German, I think, but I think you can turn off the subtitles.
Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this episode of Moderate Fantasy Violence, then please subscribe on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Whilst you're there, please leave us a review, as it helps other people find out about the show. You can also visit our website, which is www.moderatefantasyviolence.com. Up there you can listen to this episode, all our previous episodes, our bonus audio content under the name Excessive Fantasy Violence, and various bits of writing that we've done since we started the podcast, including our summaries of film and TV in 2016.
And you can also follow us on social media. We're at MFV Podcast on Twitter, and if you search Moderate Fantasy Violence on Facebook, our nice purple logo should also come up, so do give us a shout out on there. We do usually tweet before we do episodes, so if you want to have your tweets read out on air, then do let us know. Right, and before we go into the final outro, podcast contributor and official Harry Potter correspondent Claire Russo also has a new podcast, so only fair to give that a shout out. This is the Sisterhood of the Travelling Paperbacks, which you can find on iTunes and I'm assuming other podcast venues by searching. It's a fortnightly book club podcast in which she, along with co-hosts Chelsea and Kay, talk about a different book every fortnight. So far I think there's just an introductory episode up, but I think, in fact, roughly speaking, I think on exactly the same day as we're releasing this episode, they're releasing their first episode on The Dispossessed by Ursula Le Guin. And then I think 2 weeks later they're covering the comic Nimona, which I'm specifically looking forward to because Nimona's really good. So yeah, I do fully recommend reading Nimona by Noelle Stevenson and then listening to the Sisterhood of the Travelling Paperbacks episode about it 2 weeks from now. But yep, back on our own podcast for the moment. I've been Nick Bryan. You can follow me on Twitter as @NickMB, and you can also go to our website at nickbryan.com, where there is details of my self-published crime books, and also most recently details of a 4-page comic story which I've recently had published, which you can get on Comixology for only £1.49. Admittedly, it is only 4 pages as part of a much longer anthology, but for £1.49, I think it's worth it. The art's really lovely, like seriously, really, really good. Lucas Kowalczyk, who drew it, did an amazing job, and I thoroughly recommend checking that out, but then again, I did write it, so I can't pretend to be unbiased.
I've been Alastair Ball. You can find more of my writing at redtrainblog.com, or you can follow me on Twitter at AlastairJRBall. That's all we have time for this episode. Next time, we will be discussing La La Land, which has been widely tipped for Oscar success. We'll also be covering the new Dropkick Murphys album, 11 Short Stories of Pain and Glory, and Netflix's new adaptation of A Series of Unfortunate Events. And we'll be finding out what I thought of Nick's recommendation, Richard III, starring Ian McKellen. So tune in for all that next time. Until then, have a great time. Bye.
Bye.
Yeah, they released... Hang on, where's the album list? This must be riveting for people to listen to.
It won't be once I've cut it.
Yeah.